حفظ القيادة السورية على أرواح مواطنينا وأمن بلدنا.
Assad does not have significant military capability.
إذا قتلونا معتادا يحددنا.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, September 20th. I'm Yumna Naufal, and these are today's headlines. The families of the Lebanese pilgrims kidnapped in Syria's Azaz stage a sit-in near Al-Azariya building in downtown Beirut. President Michel Sleiman receives various MPs, including Bahia Hariri, to discuss the current political developments. And dozens are killed in twin attacks on military targets in Yemen. The families of the Lebanese pilgrims kidnapped in Syria's Azaz are staging a sit-in near Al-Azariya building in downtown Beirut, preventing employees of the Turkish Cultural Center and Turkish Airlines from entering their offices. Several relatives quarreled with the policemen deployed near the Turkish Airlines office after breaking the windows of the office. In May of 2012, 11 Lebanese pilgrims were kidnapped in Syria's Aleppo region as they were making their way back to Lebanon by land from pilgrimage in Iran. 2 of them have since been released, while the rest remain held in Azaz. A previously unknown group calling itself Zuwar Imam Rida had claimed the kidnapping, demanding Turkey use its influence with Syria's rebels to secure the release of 9 Lebanese kidnapped in Syria back in May. President Michel Sleiman has received MPs, including Mrs. Bahia Hariri and Hadi Hbesh, to discuss governmental issues and political developments, as well as the ongoing consultations to form a new cabinet. Sleiman and former Minister Adnan Assad also discussed the economic situation and the ongoing preparations for the International Support Group to Lebanon conference, which will be held in New York on September 25th. Assad reiterated the economic body's concerns over the repercussions of the Syrian crisis, mainly the issue of the refugees. He also praised the president and the international community's efforts to hold the International Donors Conference on the margin of the UN Assembly and said everyone should support Lebanon in helping the Syrian people. Prime Minister-designate Tamam Salam ruled out in comments published the possibility of using any future national dialogue session as a forum for the formation of the next government, as recently proposed by Speaker Nabih Berri. The formation of the government cannot wait for the national dialogue table, Salam said, adding that dialogue table is not the right place. He said that the only place to discuss a government formation is with the Prime Minister-designate and the President only. Anything other than that would be deemed unconstitutional. Salam, however, believes that the topics for discussion during all-party talks are crucial, decisive and accurate, and may require a long time before an agreement is reached. Speaker Nabih Berri is calling for 3 consecutive legislative sessions next week from Monday to Wednesday, with 45 draft laws listed on the agenda. Back in August, Parliament failed to convene for a 4th time in just over a month due to lack of quorum, prompting Berri to postpone the legislative session yet again. It was moved to September 23rd. Now, among the items on the agenda is a proposal to extend the retirement age of top military and security officials. Another local news, Registrar of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, Daryl Mundis, has concluded his official visit to Lebanon. During his mission in Beirut, the Registrar met with Prime Minister Najib Miati and Prime Minister-designate Tamam Salam and other government officials, as well as with various representatives of the diplomatic community in Lebanon. Internal security forces have detained 59 people throughout the country for committing various crimes. The crimes involve robbery, drug dealing, arms trafficking, prostitution, illegal entry into the country, illegal residency, as well as fake documentations. Syrian Deputy Prime Minister says that neither the government forces nor the rebels are currently capable of outright military victory in the country's civil war. Kadri Jamil told the British Guardian newspaper that neither the armed opposition nor the regime of Bashar al-Assad is capable of defeating the other side. He called this a zero balance of forces and predicted that it will not change for a while. This comes after U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called on the Security Council to stand up and speak out in the strongest possible terms about the importance of enforceable action to rid the world of Syria's chemical weapons. On the line, live with us from Washington, D.C. is Syrian activist Mohammed Al Abdallah to discuss this further. Hi, Mohammed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, thanks.
Mohammed, under a deal drawn up with the Russians in non-stop talks late last week in Geneva, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is supposed to make a full declaration of his chemical weapons stockpile by this weekend. However, there are doubts that this may happen. Can you tell me what are the reasons for these doubts?
Well, the United States, firstly, they're not using enough power to threat Assad. The credible threat of using power that pushed Assad and the Russians to accept negotiating and the deal of delivering the chemical weapons. However, President Obama is not showing a serious leadership on this topic. That's the first point. And then Assad is trying to gain time again and spoil the process by saying it's going to cost $1 billion.
Right. That's true. He appeared on American television promising to dispose of his chemical weapons, saying it is expensive, it will take up to a year, and it needs about $1 billion US. But who would pay for these? Because he dared the Americans to step up and pay for this.
It's very unclear what the process will be. President Assad thinks he's smart by addressing the U.S. taxpayers, by telling them, hey, you guys, you have a financial crisis already, and your government is going to cost you additional $1 billion to dispose of my chemical weapons. And he's trying to play this with the American media here in order to basically push the Congress not to accept or not to enhance President Obama's plan in military strike.
But Mohammed, President Obama's plan has been put on hold now because they're trying to reach this diplomatic solution, which they were very happy about last week in Geneva. So what is the sentiment right now in Washington?
There's clearly disagreement between the Russians and the Americans. It starts leaking into the media. There's two main points. First of all, the Russians are not happy about going to Security Council, about Chapter 7. That's the first thing. And the second thing, that the Russian is still accusing the UN investigators' report as a politicized report. And Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the UN, was very unpleased to hear such comments from the Russians. So the Russians now are stuck in the middle. And I do not anticipate that the Russians and the Americans will have the final deal on this topic, and that's why I assume the military strike, as you just said it correctly, Yumna, it's on hold, it's not off the table.
So it's not completely off the table. However, there was a lot of discussion about President Bashar al-Assad not remaining in power in the future. But recently, no one has even mentioned it. Why do you think that is? Could it be because American-Iranian relations may be improving as well?
No, that's because the Russians and the Americans trying to make this as a full deal, negotiation deal, a package deal, sort of speaking.
Where Assad would stay. Where Assad would stay.
Not exactly. The Russians and the Americans, again, they're not agreeing on the interpretation of the agreement. The exact same thing happened in Geneva 1. Now they have a problem in the interpreting the chemical weapons disposal agreement, and they have a problem about Geneva 2, because the Americans' interpretation of Geneva 2, Assad must go, which is not the Russians' interpretation.
So basically, it's just like the foreign minister said, we're at a standstill right now, where we're on hold, there's no military strike, and in Syria, they're still battling each other, people that are pro and anti-Assad.
Correct. Unfortunately, that's the main problem here. We have a crisis, big humanitarian crisis with refugees, with the IDPs, internally displaced people, and unfortunately, the world is continue watching what's happening.
So, okay, the world is continuing to watch what's happening, but you're in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure you're hearing a lot of different things on Capitol Hill. So what exactly is the people are just buying time? They're just waiting to see what's going to happen? What is needed here? What are we expecting?
There's a huge disappointment from President Obama's referral to the Congress, because both former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta and Gates, they both criticized President Obama yesterday for going to the Congress, saying that when a U.S. president setting a red line, it should be a red line, and he should punish the people.
But Mohammed, the people, when there was a vote, when there was a poll taken, the American people were very reluctant to even go to war because of what happened in Iraq, and because according to the current, according to General Dempsey, he said that it wouldn't serve American interest if eventually Assad left and then the rebels took over. So there is this hesitation, right, from the American public in terms of a strike.
Correct, but here's where the president should demonstrate leadership skills, and he should convince the public opinion that this is in the U.S. National interest, because if this country turned to be a failed state, it's going to be a land for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-like organizations, and that's the first thing. And the second thing, we're not talking about full-scale war here. We're not talking about boots on the ground. We're not talking about going to war like Iraq and Afghanistan. We're talking about limited military operation or strike. And that's what President Obama tried to explain to the American people when he addressed the nation in September 10th. However, that was a failure because he just referred to the Congress, and the Congress seems not to be very optimistic about passing this.
Right, but this is what I'm trying to say. If Congress is not optimistic and lawmakers are not on Obama's side, it's probably because he did use the argument that it is going to be a limited strike, but they still were not convinced. So it seems that the general American people also don't want to go to war. So isn't he kind of being a president that is worthy because he is listening to what the people are saying, as opposed to George W. Bush, who went without the UN Security Council approval and went into Iraq when he said there was MWDs and then there weren't any?
In fact, this is a very important point, Yumna. And actually, people in the U.S. here they're very, very overwhelmed with the cost of the two wars, and they don't want to see an additional war,
right,
especially with the financial crisis here in the U.S.
Right.
However, President Obama's administration, for 2.5 years, they just played an action role. They did not really lobby the public opinion. They did not push for any. Clearly, there is no interest in Syria. And in the past 3 weeks only, the public opinion here, the average Americans in the metro and the cafe, they start to hear about Syria. Before that, it was just topic of the news. It's not the first news.
Because the economic situation had taken over, is what you're saying.
And because administration did not make Syria as one of the priorities.
As one of the priorities. Here, my last question to you, Mohammed, is, so, you know, what we're seeing right now is the U.S. president trying to resolve this diplomatically. Do you think that this can be resolved diplomatically?
Absolutely can't be resolved diplomatically. President Obama and the Syrians, both Americans and Syrians, they don't trust the Russians and they don't trust Assad. And there's mistrust here, and that U.S. tried to work with Russia diplomatically in Geneva one, and that did not really work. And I don't think there is any reason to give the Russians and the Assad additional diplomatic chance. The only reason is the inaction and reluctance at the Obama administration.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. That is Syrian activist Mohammed Abdullah live with us from D.C. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Coming up next, 13 people, including a 3-year-old boy, are wounded during a shooting spree in Chicago, Illinois. Stay with us. Welcome back. Dozens have been killed in twin attacks on military targets in Yemen, with 2 car bombs exploding at a base early this morning and a separate shooting targeting soldiers. Officials say the car bombs detonated at a military camp in Shabwa in southern Yemen, and 20 people, soldiers and police officers, were killed at 2 posts. Gunmen killed around 10 soldiers in another attack on a military headquarters in the town of Maifa. Reporters say 56 troops have perished in both attacks. The military statement says the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda. Security forces are hunting down militants in a village near Cairo amid a lull in clashes with gunmen, as Egyptian state media is praising the liberation of Islamist bastion Kirdisi. A police general was shot dead when security forces stormed the village near the Giza pyramids in the latest crackdown on Islamist supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. The funeral of Giza Deputy Security Chief Nabil Faraj was due to take place after Friday prayers, at the same time as fresh protests called by Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood group. State television says the fighting in Kirdasi has now eased and that troops are carrying out house-to-house searches for Islamist militants on the run. 143 people have been killed in Nigeria's northeast in an attack carried out by fighters of the Boko Haram armed group disguised in military uniforms. Boko Haram fighters reportedly set up checkpoints in the Benishik area and gunned down motorists and travelers who tried to flee. Sources say 87 bodies were recovered in the bush. Authorities are still searching for more. Witnesses say the group also burned scores of homes and buildings. In the United States, 13 people, including a toddler, have been wounded in an overnight gang shooting in Chicago. The 3-year-old child was in critical condition after being shot in the ear when gunfire erupted at a park on Chicago's south side. Officials say the wounded were transported by ambulance to area hospitals. Police say no one was reported killed and no one had been arrested. Taiwan welcomes its very own version of the giant rubber duck, which has delighted crowds across the world. The 18-meter duck, a piece conceptualized by Dutch artist Florentin Hoffman, was pulled across the harbor in the southern city of Kaohsiung before it was officially unveiled at the bank. The concept is a huge Chinese hit in the financial hub of Hong Kong, and it was earlier this year, sparking a duck craze apparently unquenched by its arrival in Beijing earlier this month. Everybody's going duck crazy. And on that note, we end our bulletin for today. Let me remind you of our headlines. The families of the Lebanese pilgrims kidnapped in Syria's Azaz stage a sit-in near Al-Azariya building in downtown Beirut. President Michel Sulaiman receives various MPs, including Bahia Hariri, to discuss the current political developments. Dozens are killed in twin attacks on military targets in Yemen. That's all here from us, from the English team at Future Television. I'm Yumna Naufal. Stay tuned for our very own Serge Berberi with the news in French.
من حفظ القيادة السورية على أرواح مواطنينا وأمن بلدنا.
Assad does not have significant military capability.
إذا قتلونا مع